as they walked the winding cobblestone streets of Hamburg, the ancient city seemed to hush its clamor, catching their unwitting reflection in the dull glass of shop windows. Passers-by paused, their gazes following the couple, with expressions ranging from confusion to open perplexity. To the ordinary observer, they represented a living, insolvable riddle, a challenge to the immutable laws of the visible world. He, Moses Mendelssohn, was stooped, his heavy, almost wrought-iron hump seeming not merely a physical defect, but an eternal burden of all defeated hopes in the world. His gait was awkward, his short legs slipping clumsily on the slick stone, and his eyes, hidden beneath thick, overhanging brows, were filled with that humble timidity that constantly apologizes for the very fact of its existence. And she, Fromette Guggenheim, moved beside him, as if weightless, floating above the ground. She wore a dress, white like the finest porcelain, with a high, austere collar that only emphasized the graceful line of her neck. Her eyes, deep and luminous, like the blue of the morning, reflected neither the bustle of the noisy streets nor the dark currents of the Elbe, but something else entirely, an inner light that no shadow could extinguish. Oh, the poor, unfortunate soul, such ethereal beauty. And with him, whispered the market vendors, crossing themselves at their stalls. They desperately sought a logical explanation, turning over possible reasons like old, worn rosary beads. Perhaps he was fabulously wealthy, but his threadbare coat and worn leather shoes spoke of modest means, if not poverty. Perhaps she was blinded by youthful folly. No, her gaze was too conscious and firm for naivete. Deception. There was not a single crumb of cunning in his uncertain, barely visible smile. No one wished to accept the simple, yet incredible truth. Fromette had chosen him herself, without the slightest coercion, without calculation, without the dictates of family. She simply made her choice. How could she have done this? Sighed the townsfolk, watching her light, almost dancing steps. He was neither tall, nor handsome, nor rich, yet within him resided something that could not be found in the crowd of self-assured gentlemen with proud posture and empty promises. His name was Moses Mendelssohn, and if anyone said that his fate was born under an unlucky star, he would merely lower his eyes, concealing a smile. For that star, invisible to the world, burned in his soul with such fierce light that it was capable of dispelling any darkness, however thick. In Dessau, on those very cobblestone streets, where the air was saturated with the smell of coal smoke from the furnaces and fresh printing ink, life flowed like a sleepy, monotonous river. The bells of the old church measured out the Sunday morning, and rumors, like ubiquitous birds, flew from porch to porch in this small town where everyone knew everything about everyone. The birth of Moses Mendelssohn in the winter of 1729 became an event impossible to ignore. The boy came into the world sickly, his body distorted by a burden that fate seemed to have placed upon him from his first breath. His short, weak legs barely supported his fragile frame, and his eyes, dark as dried ink stains on ancient parchment, looked upon the world with an unusual, anxious inquisitiveness. At a time when physical strength and beauty were valued above kindness, and origin determined one's place in society, Moses was destined to be an outcast. His mother, Rahel, was a quiet woman whose hands were calloused from endless washing and daily prayers. She looked at her son with limitless tenderness, in which a constant worry lay hidden. She often brought him inside from the street when the neighborhood children began to point fingers at him. "My special boy," she would whisper, covering him with an old but warm blanket. "This world is cruel, but you are stronger than you seem." She shielded him not only from cruel mockery, but also from the cold pity of adults, which sometimes wounded even more than contempt. Hunchback. That word, spoken behind her back, cut her heart like a sharp blade. But Rahel was unwavering in her belief. Her son was not a mistake of nature. He was a gift that the world had simply not yet understood. Moses' father, Menahem, worked as a scribe of sacred manuscripts. His workshop, fragrant with wax, old leather bindings, and paper, was a true sanctuary of silence. Every morning, he bent over the parchments, inscribing letters with such sacred reverence, as if the secret of creation was hidden in each one. He treated Moses with the same strict, almost reverent tenderness, as he would a rare, priceless manuscript that must not be damaged by careless touch. "You are not like everyone else," he told his son, adjusting the spectacles that constantly slipped down his thin nose. "But that is your unique strength. God never makes a mistake." Menahem taught Moses not just calligraphy, but also the art of deep reflection, to ask bold questions, to seek the true meaning where others saw only ink marks. Moses grew up in the shadow of his physical defect, but his intellect was like a powerful torch lit in pitch darkness. He became addicted to reading early on, devouring books with the thirst of a traveler dying of drought. The Talmud, parables, ancient philosophical treatises, all these were not just texts to him, but a detailed map leading to the understanding of the world's structure. The streets of Dessau did not accept him. Children ran after him, maliciously mimicking his shuffling gait, and adults quickly looked away, as if his deformity were contagious. "Freak," the boys hissed, throwing clods of dirt at him. Moses clenched his fists, but did not shed a single tear. He learned too early that tears were an impermissible luxury. One cold, rainy autumn day, as drops tapped against the tiled roof, a noisy company of traveling performers knocked on the Mendelssohns' door. Their cloaks were dusty, and their voices boomed like market clamor. They burst unceremoniously into the workshop, where Moses, hunched over a book, traced the lines with his finger. "What luck," one of them exclaimed, giving the boy a greasy, greedy smile. "Give him to us," proposed another, rubbing his hands in anticipation. "He'll be a star, a dwarf, a hunchback. He'll cause laughter in any crowd. We'll give you food, money, and a famous name." Menahem, without lifting his head from the sacred parchment, slowly stood up. His face remained impassive, but a firm, cold steel flashed in his eyes. "My son is not for amusement," he said so quietly that the words rang out like a church bell. One of the performers tried to object, but Menahem took a step forward, and the man choked on his words. "Leave," the father added. There was no rage in his voice, only absolute, unshakable will. The performers hastily retreated, muttering awkward apologies. Moses, hiding behind the table, heard every word. In that moment, he realized his true worth. He was not a burden, not a curiosity, but a human being, loved despite everything. This unconditional love became his most reliable shield. Silence reigned in the Mendelssohns' house, not oppressive, but full. Like the breath of old folios, Moses sat at his narrow table. the quill scratching until ink stained his fingers. He wasn't just copying texts. He was searching within them. Why was the world so unfair? Why had God given him such a body? He did not complain, but these questions burned him from the inside. His father, seeing his struggle, once placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Moses, your soul is like a star. It shines even if the whole world is blind." These words were forever imprinted on the boy's heart. He made a decision. If the world does not wish to see my light, I will force it to see. By the age of 10, Moses knew the Talmud better than many adults. His memory was a bottomless well, absorbing everything in its path. He quoted entire pages by heart, and his questions baffled even Menahem. Rumors of the extraordinary boy reached the old rabbi of Dessau, a man with a face furrowed with wrinkles like bark and eyes holding the wisdom of ages. A boy who, without attending school, knows more than my students? He asked skeptically, arriving at the Mendelssohn's home. The rabbi spent the entire evening with Moses, asking questions, from the simplest to those that could make the greatest scholar ponder. Moses answered softly, but with absolute precision. His voice trembled with excitement, but his thought was crystal clear, like the first ray of morning sun. When the rabbi left, he turned to Menahem. "This boy is a gift. His mind is a torch in the darkness. Send him to Berlin. There, he will find his true calling." Menahem was silent for a long time, looking at his son. Berlin seemed as distant as another planet, noisy, indifferent, full of strangers who certainly would not forgive Moses his hump. But he saw how cramped these walls were for his son, how his mind longed for freedom, like a bird from a cage. And so, on a cold autumn morning, Moses left Dessau. In his old, worn coat, with a sack containing only 2 books and a piece of stale bread, he set out on the dusty road. His gait was uncertain. His back ached unbearably, but in his chest burned not fear, but a searing hope. He did not know what awaited him: mockery, complete loneliness, or perhaps great fame. He knew only one thing: he would never surrender. Step by step, thought by thought, he walked toward his destiny. In Berlin, his mentor became David Friedlander, a rabbi with a piercing gaze and a voice that cut through any silence. Friedlander saw in Moses not just a talented student, but a spark, ready to ignite into a mighty flame. He taught him not only the Torah, but also higher philosophy, mathematics, and foreign languages. "Your hump is not a curse," he said, adjusting the spectacles on Moses' nose. "It is your trial. Pass it with unwavering dignity." Under his teacher's guidance, Moses began to write. At first, they were modest notes, then essays where faith and reason, ancient Jewish wisdom and advanced European thought were fused together. His texts served as bridges, connecting 2 worlds that had previously regarded each other with suspicion and hostility. By the age of 20, Moses had gained renown in the narrow circles of the Berlin intelligentsia. He was invited to the homes of wealthy citizens, but not as an equal, but as an oddity, as the Jewish youth with a mind sharp as a razor. In one such drawing room, where the air was heavy with the scent of wax and expensive tobacco, he first spoke publicly. The host, a wealthy merchant, gathered guests to listen to this curiosity, the hunchbacked youth who freely discussed Kant and Leibniz. Moses stood by the fireplace, his voice trembling from internal excitement, but his words flowed like a clear, transparent stream. He spoke of the freedom of the human mind, of man as not only perishable flesh, but also an immortal spirit. The guests listened, holding their breath, and then burst into applause, elicited not by pity, but by pure astonishment. "Who would have thought," they whispered later, "such a great mind in such a pitiful body?" But through the applause, Moses saw their eyes glancing at his hump, and felt the anguish of loneliness constrict his heart like a band of ice. On the streets, his mind meant nothing. Boys still threw clods of dirt after him, and women, meeting his gaze, quickly looked away. Once, returning from the library, he overheard 2 girls giggle and say, "Look, the hunchback, just like in a witch's tale." Moses quickened his pace, but their laughter sounded in his ears like a verdict. He did not blame them. He knew the world was structured thus. Beauty opens doors, and ugliness locks them. But an unyielding determination grew in his chest. If the doors were closed, he would build his own, invisible yet unbreakable ones. He began writing articles for city newspapers, signing them with the modest initials, M.M. Mendelssohn. His texts on religious tolerance, on the right of Jews to become a full part of society, provoked fierce debate. Some called him a daring rebel, others a genius. In the literary salons, where the cream of philosophers and poets gathered, his name was mentioned more and more often. In a smoke-filled room, where the candlelight shadows danced on the floral wallpaper, Moses once engaged in a dispute with a famous theologian about the essence of God. His voice, initially quiet, gained strength, and his arguments were so logical and precise that his opponent, blushing deeply, was forced to silence. "That hunchback," one guest later remarked, "writes like an angel, but argues like a defiant demon." Moses smiled, but his soul was filled with emptiness. He had earned respect, but not warmth. His mind opened doors to salons, but not to hearts. One day in the library, saturated with the smell of old leather and polished wood, he stumbled upon a collection of poetry. The verses were strict and simple, yet breathed such warmth that they spoke of a love blind to appearance. Moses closed the book and sat motionless for a long time, looking at his thin, ink-stained hands. "Perhaps there is a place for me in this world too." This thought, timid as the first light of dawn, lit up in his heart. He did not yet know that very soon he would meet her, Fromette Guggenheim, the woman whose image would overturn his entire life. Her name first came up in a conversation with his friend Emmerich Gumpertz, a doctor with kind eyes and a habit of speaking plainly, without mincing words. "There is a girl in Hamburg," said Emmerich, pouring tea in their modest room. "Fromette Guggenheim. She is smart, incredibly beautiful, and imagine that, she reads Kant. You must see her." Moses shook his head negatively, hiding his gaze. "Emmerich, surely you jest. Who am I to her? Who am I to someone like her?" But his friend merely smiled good-naturedly. "You are Moses Mendelssohn. That is quite enough." These words, spoken with slight mockery but sincere faith, sowed a seed of hope in Moses's weary soul. He dared not dream, but the thought of Fromette began to shine ever brighter in his night sky. 18th century Hamburg was a city where the biting wind from the Elbe mixed with the spicy aromas of coffee and trade spices from the warehouses. The streets, paved with slick stone, buzzed with the voices of merchants, the clang of ship tackle, and the heavy tolling of church bells. In this world, where fates were decided by wealth and lineage, Moses Mendelssohn felt like a complete stranger. His worn coat and clumsy gait sharply contrasted with the lavish caftans and confident strides of the local rich. Yet, in his soul, burned a fire, ignited by his friend Emmerich's words. Meet Frommet Guggenheim. She is not like everyone else. He decided to go, despite the fear that gripped him. Frommet was the daughter of a wealthy Hamburg merchant, whose family was famous not only for financial success, but also for high education. Her house on the Elbe embankment gleamed with cleanliness and luxury. Stained glass windows, heavy velvet curtains, portraits of ancestors in gilded frames. Frommet herself was a ray of light amid this splendor. Tall, with flowing hair the color of ripe wheat, and eyes clear as amber in the sun. She was not affected, like most girls of her circle. Her restraint seemed like a thin armor concealing a lively, seeking soul. She easily read Kant, knew the Torah, and loved to quietly but passionately debate the meaning of human existence. And then, her gaze, fixed on Moses, became sharp, assessing. She looked at him too directly, and Moses felt his heart clench with pain. He realized she saw all of him. His deformity, his modesty, his inability to match those expected by girls of her status. The conversation broke off, and he, barely bowing, left, feeling hope shatter like thin glass. Outside, in the cold rain, he walked for a long time along the Elbe, looking at its dark, indifferent waters. Fool, he whispered to himself. Who are you to dare dream of her? But deep in his chest, next to the pain, a small, stubborn spark glowed. In her gaze, in her questions, there was something more than just pity. Returning to his cramped room, he could not close his eyes. He took up his quill and wrote her a letter, not a passionate confession, but a deep, sincere reflection. He wrote about the freedom of the spirit, about how reason can overcome any wall of prejudice, about how the soul searches for its kindred spirit. The letter was long, almost desperate in its honesty. He sent it, not expecting a reply. But 3 days later, an answer arrived, in a thin envelope, scented with her delicate perfume. Mr. Mendelssohn, Frommet wrote, your words made me think not about Kant, but about the heart. These lines turned his world upside down. He replied again, and so began their invisible dance of souls, cautious, but increasingly bold. Moses revealed his deepest fears to her, about his childhood, the mockery, the dreams in which he was free from his hump. Frommet replied with restraint, but with unwavering warmth, telling him about her solitary walks in the garden, the books she read by candlelight, the questions that troubled her. Once, she enclosed a pressed rose petal in the envelope, and Moses, holding it in his hands, felt his heart beat to a new, unfamiliar rhythm. The fear did not subside. What if she was moved only by pity? What if her interest was mere curiosity? Once, stopping at the bridge on the Elbe embankment, he watched the water reflect the lamplight, and the air smelled of salt and pitch. He remembered her clear face with a gentle, encouraging smile, and thought, if I do not take this decisive step, I will never know the truth. That evening, he wrote to her again, but this time not about philosophy, but about himself, about his feelings. Fräulein Frommet, he wrote, I dared not think of you, but I can no longer remain silent. You have become a light I did not expect. If I am mistaken, I ask you to forgive me, but if not, give me a chance. He sent the letter, and the night seemed endless. Frommet, upon receiving it, sat in her room, where the antique clock ticked steadily. She reread every line, feeling an incredible warmth spread through her chest. Her family, her circle, expected her to marry a wealthy merchant or a scholar with a grand title. But in Moses, she saw what was in no one else: absolute sincerity, a brilliant mind, and a soul unafraid to be vulnerable. She took up her quill and wrote, "Mr. Mendelssohn, you have made me wonder what is more important, appearance or heart. I do not know the answer yet, but I wish to find it." This letter became the very bridge that forever connected their worlds. Their correspondence grew like a full flowing river after a spring flood. They wrote about life, faith, and love that does not seek permission from society. Moses, accustomed to loneliness, felt for the first time that he was truly seen, not as a hunchback, not as a scholar, but as a man. 6 months later, on a frosty January day in 1762, Moses took up his quill, not for another philosophical treatise, but for the most important letter of his life. In neat but firm handwriting, he inscribed, "From it, I cannot live without you. If you say yes, I will do everything so that the word no never sounds in your heart. Please, become my wife." He sent the letter, and time in his life stopped. Every second of waiting was like a step on dangerously thin ice. The answer arrived exactly 1 week later. The envelope was weightless, almost transparent. Inside lay a single sheet with a single line. "I said yes a long time ago. I am just waiting for you to finally hear it." Moses read those words, and the world around him became unbearably bright, as if the winter sun had broken through the thickest clouds. They married on June the 22nd, 1762, in Berlin. The day was warm, with a gentle breeze, as if nature itself was blessing the union. She was 23. He was 33. She was a beauty, the educated daughter of a respected merchant. He was a short, hunchbacked philosopher who had spent his whole life swimming against the strongest current. Their marriage caused whispers, astonishment, sometimes open condemnation. But all that external noise remained outside, like a distant hum beyond the window. Inside their world reigned love, the kind that does not ask for permission, is not measured by gold, and looks not at appearance, but exclusively into the soul. Their happiness was not fairy tale-like. It was real. There were no golden carriages or lavish balls, but there were quiet morning teacups, where one glance said more than 1,000 words. There were walks in the rain, when Moses covered Fromet with his cloak, and she thanked him with a smile, as if he had just performed a heroic deed. There was long, exhausting work late into the night, and always a warm light in the window, where she awaited him. Soon, their house filled with resonant children's laughter. Life began anew 10 times, with swaddling clothes, first words, first clumsy steps. Their house became an oasis where books coexisted with children's toys, where the highest scholarship did not hinder joy, and faith did not suppress freedom. Fromet was not just a philosopher's wife. She became his muse, his unwavering support, creating an invisible but perfect harmony in which Moses could create, argue, and fight for the ideas of the Enlightenment and justice. "You know," he told her once, returning tired from a debate, "when you are silent, it is easier for me to speak." She smiled, gently touched his cheek, and replied, "And when you speak, it is easier for me to believe." Moses's works, philosophical, theological, social, spread throughout Germany and far beyond. He was respected even by his bitterest opponents. In Leipzig, Berlin, and Paris, the name Mendelssohn was spoken with reverence. He became the loud voice of reason and tolerance in an era when those words had yet to find their true meaning. Yet, he remained the same boy from Dessau, with the inkwell by the window. Only now, Fromet was beside him, his light, his home. Moses left this world in 1786. His last days were quiet, filled with peace. He held her hand until his very last breath. They say his final smile was addressed to her. Fromet survived him by 26 years, living not as a widow, but as the timeless keeper of their shared great memory. She died in 1812. Now they rest side by side, their story, simple and bright, like a melody written only for two. Stories of such love do not end. They merely transform. They continue to live in children, in actions, in the very air that their home breathed. Many years after Moses and Fromet passed, their grandson, Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy, was born. He grew up in a house where music and books were equally welcome guests, where the memory of his grandfather's and grandmother's love lived in family stories and sacred silence. Unaware of all the details, Felix carried their light within him. He became a prodigy, writing symphonies at 10, conducting orchestras at 16. But one of his most brilliant compositions was the music for Shakespeare's play, A Midsummer Night's Dream, completed in 1842. Among its pieces was the Wedding March, light, triumphant, paving the way as if through a blossoming garden. It was first performed on a court stage. The hall fell silent when the first fanfare notes sounded, and then the audience rose to their feet, not out of etiquette, but because this music promised absolute heavenly happiness. The true worldwide triumph came in 1858, when Queen Victoria's daughter, Princess Victoria, chose the march for her wedding to crown Prince Frederick of Prussia. It resounded beneath the majestic arches of the royal chapel. Since then, millions of brides around the world walk down the aisle to these notes. The march is played in village churches and grand cathedrals, at the weddings of modest teachers and famous movie stars. It has become an eternal symbol of the promise to be together, no matter what. But few people know that this march, a hymn to all-conquering joy, might never have been born. It grew out of the very love that accepted the hunchbacked philosopher at the very hour when the rest of the world looked away. Without Fromet, who spoke her fearless yes to the rejected yet devoted Moses, there would be no grandson, no music, no notes under which millions of hearts pledge their fidelity. This story is a great reminder that neither wealth, nor appearance, nor a famous name, but only faith, courage, and true love are capable of creating the music that will resonate eternally. And sometimes, for the Mendelssohn's March to become a hymn of happiness, all it takes is one woman who was not afraid to say yes.